The man who listened to winter. They handed him a lantern with almost no oil in it. That was their answer. A weathered man stood at the edge of a sleeping town, his coat thin against a cold that had no business arriving this early. Behind him a door swung shut. A lock turned. Inside, warm light. Outside, only him, an old dog, and the long white dark. He had told them the truth. He had read it in the frost that clung to one side of every fence post, in the way the birds flew wrong, in a quiet to be ordinary. And for the truth, they called him a liar. So he turned toward the mountains no sane man walked into in winter, not to die out there, to prove something, to himself mostly. The dog pressed close and did not look back. The man carried a dead relative's worn journal under one arm and a black iron key that opened a door he had never seen. Somewhere up in that frozen stone, there was a hollow waiting, a place that could keep a man alive or bury him. Before that winter was through, the same people who shut that door would climb these slopes on their knees, begging. But that part comes later. For now, there is only a man, a dog, and a long walk into the white. The first sign came the way most truths do, quietly, when no one was looking. A weathered man stood in the yard behind the relief house, watching the light come up gray over the valley. His name was Ezra Holt. His hands were the kind that had worked through too many cold seasons to count, cracked at the knuckles, slow to warm. And on that morning, before the town had stirred, before a single chimney breathed smoke, he saw something the others would not see for weeks. Frost. But only on one side. The northern face of every fence post wore a thin white skin, while the southern side still sat dark and wet with mud. He stood there a long moment, the way a person stands when the world has just whispered something it should not yet know. Beside him, the dog refused to lie down. Cinder was old now, an old shepherd hound with a gray muzzle and a stiffness in his back legs that came on hard in the cold. Most mornings he found a wall to lean against and slept through the early hours. But not this morning. This morning he paced. Once, twice. Then he settled against the southern side of the building, as far from the north wall as the yard would allow. Ezra noticed that before he noticed the chimes. The little strips of metal hanging by the kitchen door were ringing, soft, almost shy. Not the busy chatter they made when the usual wind came in from the west. This was something else. This came down from the mountains. He had learned a long time ago that the air changes its smell before it changes anything else. And the air that morning smelled dry, sharp, like something far away had already turned to ice and was only now sending word ahead. 3 weeks, maybe more. That was how early it was coming. And Ezra Holt knew, standing in that frozen yard, that he was about to do the one thing the town would never forgive him for. He was going to tell them. The people of Hollow Creek gathered after breakfast, the way they always did when there was talk in the air. They came in their coats and their certainty, stamping their boots on the porch boards, breath rising in little clouds. The valley was small. Everyone knew everyone. And everyone, by now, had an opinion about the strange man who lived too close to the mountains and too far from the rest of them. He did not waste their time with soft words. "Double your firewood," he said. "Salt down more meat than you think you'll need. Brace the roofs before the heavy snow comes. And it is coming. Early." For a moment, no one spoke. Then they laughed. Not all of them, but enough. The laugh of people who needed it not to be true. Reverend Silas Crane stepped forward, and the crowd quieted for him, the way crowds do for a man who has learned to use his voice as a tool. He was tall and unhurried, with the kind of face that looked patient even when it wasn't. "Fear," he said gently, "is a sickness, and it spreads faster than any weather." He looked at Ezra the way one looks at a child who has frightened the other children. "Some men spend too long alone in the cold," he went on, "long enough to forget how to trust anything but their own dark thoughts." A few more laughs, quieter this time, the kind that sting more. Ezra said nothing. He had learned long ago that you cannot argue a man out of comfort. Comfort is not a position. It is a wall. And then a woman spoke. She did not laugh. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood near the door of the relief house with her arms folded, and when she spoke, the whole crowd turned. Edith Vance, the woman who ran the relief house, who counted the flour and measured the soup, and decided in lean seasons who ate and who waited. She had a hard face, the kind of hardness that doesn't come from cruelty, but from carrying too much for too long. "The relief house cannot afford panic," she said. "Not when the shelves are already this thin." That was all, but it was enough. Because when Edith Vance spoke, Hollow Creek listened. What none of them saw was the way her hand moved as she said it, slipping into the pocket of her coat, closing around something small, something she did not take out, did not show, did not name. Her knuckles went white around it, and for the briefest second, so brief that even Ezra almost missed it, something crossed her face that did not belong to a woman dismissing a fool. It looked, for just that 1 second, like fear, not of the winter, of him, or of what would happen to him. But the second passed. Her hand stayed in her pocket, and the crowd, satisfied, began to drift back into the warmth of their mourning. Ezra Holt had spent the better part of his life learning to read a thing most people never bother to read: the world itself. He had learned it from his uncle, a man named Jonah Holt, who was gone now, but who lived on in the way Ezra still looked at smoke and stone and the wrong way flight of birds. Jonah had been a trapper, a mender of broken things, a man who spent more time in the high country than among people, and who trusted patterns more than he ever trusted promises. "Men forget," Jonah used to say. "The ground doesn't." Ezra could still feel it, the memory of being a boy, his small hand pressed flat against a slab of dark stone, still warm long after the sun had gone down. "Stone keeps heat longer than people," his uncle had told him. "Remember that. Someday it'll matter more than you think." Jonah taught him to watch the snow on the bark of pines, to listen for water still moving under ice, to notice when the smoke from a far-off fire flattened low and crept along the ground instead of climbing, because that meant the air was pressing down, and the air only pressed down before a storm. He taught him to watch the elk. When the elk came down from the high ridges too early, they were not being lazy. They were being honest. They knew something, and the man who watched them knew it too. Every sign went into a journal, a worn thing, wrapped in oilcloth, its pages crowded with temperatures and snowfall marks and small drawings of wind. Jonah carried it everywhere. And when Jonah died, The journal came to Ezra the way a name comes to a child, without asking, and forever. By the time the frost came early to Hollow Creek, Ezra had already filled 12 pages. The elk had come down too soon. The creek had grown a thin rim of ice each dawn, and each dawn the ice had stayed a little longer. The crows had crossed the valley in the wrong direction 3 days running. The ground was not lying. It never lied. It was only that no one wanted to listen. He tried, even then. One more time. He went to the supply room and asked for extra lamp oil and salt and pork to lay by. Otis Bell, the heavy-set man who kept the shelves, would not sell it to him. "Not feeding panic this year," Otis said, and turned his back, and busied his hands with something that did not need doing. Outside, a freight driver was tightening the straps on a half-loaded wagon, his breath smoking in the cold. He glanced at the man, and then, low, so the town would not hear him say it, he muttered that the big lake at the valley's mouth had already grown a skin of ice along its near shore. "Too early," the driver said. "Way too early." Nobody answered him. Nobody looked directly at the man as he walked away through the freezing mud, the dog at his heel, the empty space where the salt and the oil should have been as heavy in his arms as anything he might have carried. He understood then what was coming, not the weather. He had understood the weather for weeks. What he understood now was the people. That a town will let itself freeze before it will let itself be wrong. That a comfort a crowd has agreed on is harder to break than river ice. He stopped trying after that. Some truths a man can only set down at the edge of a sleeping town and walk away from and leave for the winter itself to prove. That evening, the cold came down harder. The mud in the wagon ruts stiffened before dark, holding the shape of the day's wheels like a memory turning to stone. And as the lanterns came up gold in the windows of the relief house, a small figure slipped out the back door. A boy. His name was Toby Lane. He could not have been more than 10, and he walked with a limp that turned every step into a small act of will. He swept the kitchen ashes each morning in exchange for a corner to sleep in. The town tolerated him the way towns tolerate the ones they would rather not look at directly. He came across the frozen yard with something hidden in his hands. Half a biscuit, dry, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. He crouched beside the old dog and fed it to him in tiny pieces, slow and careful, so that no one inside would hear the crunch and come asking questions. Cinder took the food gently, as if he understood, as if he knew this boy was spending something he could not spare. Then Toby looked up at the man standing in the dark, and he reached into his coat and pulled out a knife. An old folding knife, the handle worn smooth by a hand that was no longer alive to hold it. "It was my pa's," the boy whispered. He held it out. For a long moment, Ezra looked at the small offering in the small hand. A child giving away the last thing that tied him to a father. Giving it to a man the whole town had laughed at that very morning. Ezra knelt. Slowly, because his knees were not young. He closed the boy's cold fingers back around the knife. "Keep it," he said. "Keep the one thing that still belongs to you." The boy's eyes shone in the dark. He opened his mouth to say something, and the back door opened. Light spilled across the frozen yard. Edith Vance stood in the doorway with a lamp in one hand. And the moment she saw the boy outside in the cold, Her face hardened into something flat and final. She crossed the yard fast. She took Toby by the shoulder, harder than she needed to, in front of the other children who had begun to gather in the doorway behind her. And the dog moved. Cinder, old and stiff and slow, stepped between them, not growling, not baring teeth. He simply placed his body in the small space between the woman's hand and the boy, and stood there, low and still, ears flat, eyes steady. For one breath, no one moved at all. The lamp trembled in Edith's hand. And in that strange, suspended quiet, the boy turned his face up toward Ezra and asked the question that would follow the man all the way into the mountains. "If you're right," Toby whispered, "what happens to us?" Ezra did not answer. He could not, because the only honest answer was one no child should have to hear. Edith pulled the boy back toward the door. The light withdrew, and the yard went dark again, and cold, and quiet. That night, the order came. She told him to be gone before sunrise. The relief house could not feed a man who fed the town's fear. There was no malice in the way she said it. There rarely was with Edith Vance, only that same hardness. And beneath it, something he could not name and did not have the time to. So he gathered what little was his. The journal wrapped in its oilcloth, a black iron key, heavy and cold, that had come to him along with the journal, and a single line of instruction he had never understood. An old hatchet, its handle marked with a carving his uncle had cut years ago. And the dog. Always the dog. The door of the relief house closed behind him a little after midnight. It shut with a hard wooden sound that carried across the frozen yard and seemed to keep traveling long after it should have stopped. Ezra Holt stood in the dark for a moment. He did not knock. He did not ask to be let back in. He simply turned, and the old dog turned with him, pressing close against his leg, facing north toward the black shape of the mountains. Cinder did not look back at Hollow Creek, not once, and somehow that steadied the man more than any human word could have. He left before the town woke. The valley still slept beneath its thin chimney smoke and its weak lantern light. Frost lay over the wagon road like sifted flour, untouched, perfect, waiting. Somewhere behind the buildings, a loose sheet of tin slapped softly against a roof in the wind, over and over, like a clock that had lost its sense of time. He did not have a destination. Not really. He had a line. A single line, written in his uncle's hand inside the oilcloth journal, in ink that had faded almost to brown. Find the place where black stone grows out of the mountain. That was all. No map, no name, no how or how far. But Jonah Holt had never written a word he did not mean. And so the man turned west, toward the high country, toward a place he had never seen, on the strength of a sentence left behind by a dead man who had loved him. It was either faith, or it was foolishness. Out there in the cold, the two looked very much alike. By midday, the wind found its strength. It came down off the heights in long, dry streaks, dragging fine snow across the open ground in ribbons that hissed when they crossed bare rock. There were no storm clouds yet. That was the strange thing. The sky stayed pale and high and almost gentle, but the snow moved anyway, pushed ahead of something still coming. The cold was a dry cold, the worst kind. It did not numb so much as it bit, splitting the skin across his knuckles until thin lines of blood marked the wooden handle of the hatchet each time he gripped it. He wrapped his hands. The blood soaked through. He stopped noticing. Cinder kept pace behind him, head low, stopping now and then to lift his nose toward the mountains and read whatever it was the wind kept whispering. When the dog stopped, Ezra stopped. He had learned long ago to trust the dog's nose more than his own eyes. That first night, they sheltered in the lee of a ridge, and the old dog refused to sleep apart from him. Cinder pressed his whole weight against the man's back beneath the blankets, and every few minutes lifted his head to test the dark, then lowered it again, only to lift it once more. Neither of them slept much. The mountains did not want them. That much was clear. By the second day, the cold had begun taking him apart, one small piece at a time. The bread in his pack froze hard as wood by morning, then went damp and sour by afternoon when his body heat thawed it against his chest. His hands shook badly enough that lighting a match became a small war he often lost. Twice he sat down on a stone, meaning to rest for a moment, and came back to himself some unknown stretch of time later, the cold creeping up through the rock into his bones, the dog's teeth pulling insistently at his sleeve. It was Cinder who got him up the second time. The old dog grabbed his coat and pulled, and would not stop pulling, until the man finally understood that lying still in this country meant lying still forever. He got up. He kept walking. That afternoon, sheltering from the wind behind a wall of stone, he did something he had not done in a long time. He opened the journal. Not to read the weather marks. He knew those by heart. He opened it the way a person opens an old letter from someone they have lost, just to see the handwriting again. And tucked between two crowded pages, he found something he had never seen before. A folded square of oil paper, his uncle's hand. Unmistakable, slanting, urgent, written by a man who knew he would not be there to explain. "If you are reading this," it began, "then the town has finally done the thing I always feared it would." The man's breath caught. He read on, slow, his eyes burning in the wind. Below the words, his uncle had drawn a rough map, a line of ridges climbing west, a mark where the black stone was, and beneath the map, one more line, the last thing Jonah Holt had ever left for him. Don't argue with people who won't look at the snow. Ezra Holt sat very still for a long time, the wind moving through the timber above him like distant water, and he understood that his uncle had known somehow that this day would come, had reached forward through the years to put a hand on his shoulder when no living hand would. He folded the paper, he put it back, and he kept climbing. The second night was the one that nearly took him. The wind had dropped, which sounds like mercy and is not. When the wind drops in that country, the cold comes down straight out of the black sky, heavy and still, and it presses on a man like water closing over his head. The fire he managed was small and mean, more smoke than heat, and it died before the middle of the night, no matter how he fed it. He lay against the dog and shook. And somewhere in the worst of it, he found himself talking, not to the dog, to a man who was not there. "You could have told me where," he said into the dark, to his uncle, to the cold, to all the years between them. "You drew a map and left out the part where I freeze before I reach it." The dead man, of course, said nothing. But the memory came anyway, the way the memories had been coming since he walked out of the valley. His uncle on a night not so different. Somewhere in the deep timber, the two of them shaking against the same kind of cold, and the boy he had been, asking why they did not just turn back. Because turning back is its own kind of dying, the old man had said. Slower, warmer, but the same in the end. The man lay in the dark and held on to that. Turning back is its own kind of dying. He did not turn back. When the gray light finally came, weak and grudging, he was still alive, and so was the dog. And that, he had decided, was the only argument that mattered. Late on the third afternoon, the country changed. The pines thinned. The slopes steepened. And then, rising out of the mountainside like something burned and ancient, he saw it. Black stone, dark basalt, sheer and cracked, climbing up out of the snow as if the mountain had pushed it through from somewhere deep below. Snow clung to the cracks in thin white lines. The wind screamed across the ridge above, but the stone itself seemed to swallow the sound. Find the place where black stone grows out of the mountain. He had found it. His legs nearly went out from under him. Not from relief. He had no relief left in him. Just a dull, animal recognition that the dead man had told the truth. He worked his way along the base of the cliff, half blind in the blowing snow, the dog limping ahead of him now, nose working. And then Cinder stopped and barked, once, sharp. There, half hidden behind a tangle of dead brush and drifted snow. A door, a narrow wooden door, set right into the black rock, weathered nearly the color of the stone around it, so that a man could have walked past it 100 times and never known. His hands were shaking too hard to be of much use. He cleared the brush. He found the lock, frozen solid, a knot of ice and old iron. He drew the black key from his coat, the key that had come to him with the journal, the key he had carried for years without knowing what it opened. It fit. Of course it fit. But the lock would not turn. The ice had welded it shut. So he forced it, both hands around the key, his whole weight behind it, blood opening fresh across his knuckles, the wind tearing at his back. He pushed until something deep in the iron finally gave way, with a low, cracking sound that he felt more than heard. The door swung inward, and the dark inside swallowed everything. He stood in the doorway, swaying, half frozen, and he noticed 3 things in the space of a single breath. The first thing was the silence. No wind. For 3 days the wind had been a living thing clawing at him, and now, suddenly, it was gone. The air inside did not move at all. It simply was, still and whole, and waiting. The second thing was the warmth. Not the warmth of a fire. There was no fire. It was fainter than that. Deeper. A weak, patient warmth that seemed to rise up out of the stone itself, as if the mountain had been holding a small amount of heat in trust for a very long time, waiting for someone to come and need it. And the third thing came as his eyes adjusted to the dark. Somewhere ahead, in the blackness, came a sound he had not heard in 3 days. Water. Moving water. A thin stream running quietly along one wall, with no ice on it. None at all. He stepped inside. The dog followed, silent now, and walked past him into the shadows, circled once near a dry slab of rock, and lay down with a long, shuddering breath. The breath of an old creature that has finally found a place to rest. Ezra moved toward the stream. His hand found the wall to steady himself, and his fingers touched something carved. Letters, cut deep into the black basalt by a hand he had known and loved and buried. J.H., his uncle's initials. The man stood in the dark with his fingers pressed to the carving the way he had once pressed his small boy's hand to a slab of warm stone. And for the first time since the door of the relief house had closed behind him, since the laughter, since the boy's question, he could not answer. He sat down. He sat down in the dark, and the quiet, and the strange, waiting warmth, and he did not look back toward the valley, not once. Outside, the wind went on screaming across the ridge. Out there, the early winter was coming for Hollow Creek exactly as he had said it would, indifferent and enormous and deaf to every prayer. Out there, a hard-faced woman was lying awake with her hand closed around something she had not shown anyone. Out there, a lame boy was sweeping ashes and wondering what would happen to them all. But in here, in the dark heart of the black stone, where a dead man had left a door and a key and a single line of faith, there was no wind. There was warmth. There was water that would not freeze. And there was a man who had been called a liar, sitting beside an old dog in the one place on earth that had been waiting all this time just for him. He did not yet know what he would build here. He did not yet know who would climb these slopes before the winter ended, or what it would cost them to do it. He only knew that night, leaning his head back against his uncle's carving while the dog breathed slow and even in the dark, that he was not finished. Not yet. The mountain had taken almost everything he had, but it had given him a door. And a man who still has a door, still has a chance. Morning came without a sun, or rather, the light came, gray and slow, seeping through the cracks in the black stone. But the sun itself never showed its face. It would be like that for a long while now. The man understood this. Up here, in the high country, winter did not arrive like a guest. It arrived like an owner, quietly taking back what had always been its own. Ezra Holt woke stiff and aching beside the cold ashes of no fire. For a moment he did not move. He listened. No wind. Still no wind. Only the small, patient voice of the underground stream running along the far wall the way it had run, he supposed, for longer than any man had been alive to hear it. The dog was awake already. Cinder lay near the dry slab of rock where he had collapsed the night before, head up, ears working, watching the man with the steady attention of a creature who has decided that this person is the only warm thing left in the world. Ezra sat up. His joints complained. His hands, when he unwrapped them, were a ruin of split skin and dried blood. But he was alive. And alive, he had learned long ago, was not a feeling. It was a job. So he began. The cave kept the wind out. That much the mountain had given him for free. But a man does not live through a hard winter on shelter alone. Shelter is only the beginning. Shelter is the wall. After the wall comes the work, and the work never ends, and the work is the only thing standing between a body and the cold that wants it. He went out into the timber above the ridge. The first trip nearly broke him. He found a deadfall of lodgepole pine, dry and gray, and he dragged it down the slope, one length at a time, the snow to his knees, the wind shoving at his back like a hand that wanted him gone. By the third trip, his shoulders burned so badly he could not lift the hatchet above his waist. By the fifth, his breath came in ragged white tears. Cinder followed him every step. The old dog could not carry wood. He could not chop or haul or build. But he followed, stopping now and then to lift his nose toward the mountains and listen to something the man could not hear. And somehow the company of him made the slope a little shorter. Inside, Ezra built a wall near the entrance, willow lattice, packed with clay and horsehair, the way his uncle had once shown him beside a fire. So long ago, the memory had gone soft at the edges. Heavy slabs of basalt formed the base, where the cold air gathered thickest along the floor. The work moved slowly. The clay froze in the bucket if he left it too near the door. His fingers cracked and bled and cracked again. But the wall rose. And one evening, as the gray light failed, he stepped back and looked at it. And for the first time, the cave felt less like a hole in a mountain, and more like a place where a man might decide to stay. Now he needed fire. A cave will keep the wind off you. It will not keep you warm. Stone is patient, but stone is also cold. And a man who sleeps long enough on cold stone simply does not wake up. So he built a hearth. He found a narrow crack in the ceiling, far back where the rock rose into darkness. His uncle had marked it years ago with a small notch cut into the stone, a sign that said plainly, "Here the smoke can leave." He laid the firebed beneath it. He gathered the driest wood. He struck his match with hands that would barely obey him, and the fire caught. For one beautiful moment, the flames climbed, and warmth bloomed against his frozen face, and the man closed his eyes and felt something dangerously close to peace. Then the smoke turned on him. It did not rise. That was the first wrong thing. It gathered against the low ceiling and spread sideways, a thickening gray ceiling of its own, and it began to come down. Wet heat crawled along the stone in dark patches. The air grew sharp, then biting, then unbreathable, and the dog began to cough. Cinder lurched up from beside the fire, his whole old body heaving, stumbling away toward the back of the cave with his head low. The sound of it cut through the man like a blade. Ezra killed the fire, fast, with dirt and ash, both hands, no hesitation. He smothered the warmth he had fought so hard to make, because the warmth was killing the only living thing that still chose to stay near him. Then he knelt beside the dog in the dark, in the cold, in the bitter smoke, and waited for the coughing to ease. It eased, slowly, but it left the man shaken in a way the cold never had. He sat for a long while after that, alone, the cave colder now than before he had ever lit a thing. And he opened the journal across his knees, not to read it, just to hold it. And in the holding, the memory came. His uncle, beside a trapper's cabin somewhere in the deep timber, a younger Ezra at his side, a fire that had smoked the same hateful way, and Jonah Holt crouched over it, not angry, never angry, only curious, saying the thing that came back to him now across all the years between. Smoke doesn't climb toward the hole, boy. People think it does. It doesn't. A pause. The old man's eyes, bright in the firelight. Smoke climbs toward where the air's thin, toward less weight. You don't aim it at the opening, you aim it at the pressure. The man sat up in the dark. He had built the hearth to send the smoke toward the crack, but he had trapped the draft against itself. He had given the smoke a door, and no reason to walk through it. He lit a single candle, and he carried it, slow, around the unfinished hearth, watching the small flame the way a man watches the face of someone he loves for the truth they won't say out loud. Near the ceiling crack, the flame bent sideways. Not up, sideways. There it was. The smoke shelf sat too low. The air had nowhere to gather and lift. He had built a beautiful, useless thing. So that night, he tore half of it apart. He pulled the stonework down with bleeding hands, in the dark, by candlelight, the dog watching him from the safe far wall with a wariness that broke the man's heart a little. And he started over. The work was brutal. He raised the firebed higher onto flat slabs of shale, lifting it up out of the layer of cold that pooled along the floor. He bent an old sheet of tin into a crude shelf above the flames to catch the smoke and turn it, to teach it where to go. And then, the hardest part, he took the pry bar and the back of the hatchet, and he began to widen the crack in the ceiling itself, stone against stone. The sound of it went deep into the mountain, metal striking rock, rock breaking loose, inch by stubborn inch, the wind screaming outside the cave mouth, and inside, only the ringing blows and the man's labored breathing and the dust sifting down through the candlelight. His hands swelled so badly by the second evening that he could barely close them around the bar. He kept going, because there was no one else to do it, because the dog was watching, because somewhere out beyond the black stone, an early winter was coming exactly as he had promised, and a man does not get to quit just because his hands have failed him. And then, near dusk on the second day, he lit the fire again. The flames flickered low against the shale. He held his breath. He did not move. For a moment, nothing. And then the draft caught. The smoke gathered under the tin shelf, hesitated, and pulled upward. A thin, steady ribbon of gray, rising clean toward the widened crack, climbing the way it was always meant to climb, toward the thin air, toward the pressure, out into the screaming dark above the ridge. The man stood very still. He lifted the candle. He carried it around the hearth one more time, his heart pounding harder than the work alone could explain. The flame barely trembled. Outside, the wind hammered the ridge hard enough to shake snow loose from the pines, but inside, the smoke rose clean. And an hour later, when he looked up, the wet patches that had stained the ceiling stone had begun to dry. He did not cheer. He was not a man who cheered. He simply sat and watched the fire he had finally taught to behave, and felt the warmth come into the room and stay there the way warmth was supposed to. But that was not how he knew it had worked. He knew it had worked because of the dog. Cinder rose from the cold far wall, slow, stiff. He lifted his gray muzzle and sniffed the air once, twice, and then the old hound crossed the cave all the way to the warm stone beside the fire and circled twice, and lay down with a long, tired groan that seemed to come up from the very bottom of him. The man watched him do it, and something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight since the door of the relief house closed, loosened, just a little. That was the thing about the dog. The dog did not lie. The dog did not flatter, or doubt, or call a man a fool. The dog only went where the warmth was real, and the dog had chosen the fire. That night, for the first time since he had walked out into the white, Ezra Holt lay down to sleep without resting the hatchet across his chest. He let himself be tired. He let himself, for a few hours, simply be a man who had built something that worked. 3 mornings later, someone saw the smoke. Not the town. The valley sat too low, tucked beneath its ridges, to ever notice the thin gray line slipping out of a crack in the high black stone. Hollow Creek had forgotten the man already. People are good at that. Forgetting is how they keep the comfort. But high on the western slope, an old man saw it. A scout, a reader of trap lines and animal sign, a man who had spent more of his life in the high country than among other people, the way certain men do when the world below has disappointed them too many times. His name was Ransom Brooks, and Ransom Brooks knew, the moment he saw that smoke, that something was wrong with it, because no campfire smoke rises that steadily in a winter wind. A campfire gutters, it coughs, it lurches with every gust. But this smoke climbed clean and straight and certain. The smoke of something built, something controlled, something that had been made to hold against the weather instead of merely surviving it. And only one man Ransom Brooks had ever known built smoke like that. But that man was dead. So the old scout came down off the slope to see who had learned a dead man's trick. The dog knew before the man did. Late in the afternoon, Cinder lifted his head near the entrance and went completely, perfectly still. He did not bark. That worried Ezra more than barking would have. The dog stepped in front of the doorway, nose lifted toward the air outside, his whole body a question. Then came the footsteps. Slow, careful, heavy enough to belong to an older man carrying weight, not the stumbling, desperate rhythm of someone freezing to death. Something steadier, something that knew this country. Ezra met him outside, the hatchet low in one hand. "Rifle goes in the snow," he said, then 15 steps back. The stranger did not argue. An old man, weathered down to rope and leather, his beard hung with ice. He laid the rifle in the snow without a word, and backed away, his hands open at his sides. And only then, as the man straightened, did Ezra see where his eyes had gone, to the hatchet, to the carving on its handle. The old scout's eyes narrowed, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with cold, and with something older than cold. "Jonah Holt carried that mark," he said. The wind moved through the pines above them. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Then the scout looked past Ezra, to the dark mouth of the cave, to the thin smoke rising clean from the ridge. "He pulled me into this place once," Ransom Brooks said quietly, after the slide came down off the high shoulder. "Buried half the mountain. Kept me alive in there longer than a man's got any right to last." He shook his head, slow, the memory moving behind his old eyes. "I'd have died on that slope. Would have. He didn't let me." Cinder walked forward then. The old dog crossed the snow and sniffed the stranger's gloves, once carefully, then turned and walked back to the man he had chosen, and that, somehow, settled it. The old hound had weighed the stranger in the only scale that mattered to him, and chosen to come back. Inside the cave, the old scout stood near the hearth and watched the smoke disappear cleanly through the widened crack overhead, and a faint smile moved across his weather-cut face. He stood there a long time, just watching it climb. "Jonah didn't prepare a cave," he said at last. His voice had gone soft, almost reverent. "Folks think that's what he did. It isn't." He looked at the warm stone, the dry bedding, the fire that knew where to send its smoke. He prepared a place, the old man said, where the weather couldn't argue with a man. The words landed in the quiet and stayed there. Ezra Holt did not answer. He did not need to. He only looked at the carving on the wall, the two initials cut deep into the black stone by a hand that had reached forward through all these years to keep a man alive who hadn't even known he would need keeping. A dead man still building shelters, still pulling the half-frozen in out of the dark, long after he was gone. Ransom Brooks stayed a few days before the next weather came down off the heights. He did not teach the way the preacher down in the valley taught, with a voice and a pulpit and the certainty of a man who has never once been wrong. Ransom taught the way the old country teaches. By working, he showed, without saying much, that hardwood burns slower than pine and holds its coals through the long, cruel hours before dawn. That bedding needs a layer of dead air beneath it, or the ground will breathe its cold and its wet up into a man's blankets while he sleeps. That fresh hides have to dry beside moving heat, never over open flame, or they rot from the inside before they ever cure. Outside the entrance, he spread gravel across the muddy ground where the snow melted and ran. "Most shelters don't die of cold," he said once, hammering a frozen stone loose with the pry bar. "They die of wet. Cold just gets the credit." Ezra listened. He was not a man too proud to listen, but it was his hands that did the building, his back that hauled the wood, his mind that turned each lesson over and made it his own. The old scout lit no fires here, raised no walls, dug no trenches. He pointed sometimes. He nodded sometimes. The work was Ezra's, and the old man seemed to want it that way, as if he understood that a thing you are given does not keep you alive the way a thing you build does. Then, on the third night, the cold turned mean. It came after midnight, the way the worst of it always does. The wind struck the mountain hard enough to shake dust down from the ceiling cracks, and along the lower stone overhead, where the warm air met the deep cold of the rock, a thin sweat of moisture gathered and froze. By the small hours, pale sheets of ice had crept across the lower ceiling. The warmth the man had fought so hard for was condensing against the stone and turning to frost and dripping, and by morning the blankets were damp again, and the chill had come crawling back across the floor like something that had only been pretending to leave. And the dog moved. Cinder rose from his warm spot beside the hearth and crossed to the entrance, where the air was colder but drier, and lay down there instead. The man came awake the instant he saw it, because he had learned to read the dog the way his uncle had taught him to read the snow. And the dog had just told him something was wrong. The cave was breathing badly again. He did not wake the old scout. This was his to fix. So he worked through the rest of that night. He dug a narrow vent trench alongside the smoke channel to pull the wet air through and out, to give the moisture somewhere to go besides the ceiling and the blankets and the lungs of an old dog. The cold air rolled across the floor around his knees. Clay packed black beneath his fingernails. Melt water soaked through his sleeves to the skin. More than once he stopped, not to rest, to watch the candle, to study the way the small flame leaned, to read the moving air the way other men read print, until he understood exactly where the wet was pooling and exactly where it needed to go. Near sunrise, the change came. The ceiling stone began to dry. The frost thinned. The dripping stopped, one slow drop at a time, until it stopped altogether. And the dog got up. Cinder crossed the cave, slow in the early gray, and circled near the hearth, and lay back down in his old warm spot beside the fire, and let out the long groan of a creature settling in for good. The man sat back on his heels. He had not slept. His hands had stopped bleeding only because they had gone numb. But the cave was breathing right again, and the dog had come back to the fire. That was all the proof he needed. The old scout, it turned out, had been awake the whole time. He had watched the man work through the entire night without sleep, without complaint, without ever once asking for help. And in the morning light, Ransom Brooks gave a small, tired nod. Jonah used to fight a shelter the same way, he said, through the night, on his hands and knees, cursing the stone. He almost smiled. Never trusted a roof, the old man said, until it failed him once. Said a roof that hadn't failed yet was just a roof you didn't understand. He gathered his rifle the next morning, and his few things, and he stood for a moment in the cave mouth looking back at the warm stone and the clean smoke and the man who had earned both. "You'll do," was all he said. Then he was gone, back up into the white, an old shape swallowed by the country he had given his life to, and Ezra Holt was alone again. But it was a different kind of alone now. The cave held warmth. The smoke knew its way out. The bedding stayed dry. The wall at the entrance turned back the worst of the wind. He had taken a hole in a mountain and made it into a place a man could live. It should have been enough. It was not, because a man cannot eat warmth. It was while he was digging out the wood storage, deeper into the back of the cave, that he found the thing that would change everything. He had pulled aside a shelf of loose basalt near the underground stream, looking only for dry space to stack his pine, and he noticed the earth, one narrow strip of dark soil, there along the stream, that stayed soft no matter how cold the night had been. The rest of the cave floor went hard and frozen in the small hours, but not this. This stayed soft and warm, not steaming, nothing so dramatic as that. Just warm. A deep, quiet, patient warmth. The same warmth he had felt the very first night, rising up out of the stone from somewhere far below the mountain. He knelt beside it and pressed his hand flat against it, and the memory came again, unbidden, soft as snowfall. A boy's small hand, pressed against a slab of dark stone, still warm long after the sun had gone down. "Stone keeps heat longer than people," his uncle had said. "Someday, it'll matter more than you think." The man knelt there in the dark for a long time, his hand against the warm earth. And he understood that the day his uncle had spoken of had finally come. He tested it carefully. He mixed wood ash from the hearth into the dark soil to loosen it the way he had been taught. Old tin food boxes became shallow trays, and from the very bottom of his uncle's worn supply sack, wrapped in a square of faded cloth he had nearly thrown away, he found seeds, onion tops, mountain cress, a little knot of turnip seed. His uncle had left those too. Of course he had. The first attempt failed. Too much moisture gathered beneath the trays, down close to the stream. Several seeds rotted before they ever woke. A thin white fungus spread along the edges of the soil like a frost that would not melt, And the man knelt over the ruined trays and felt the old familiar weight of a thing that would not work. But he had learned something by now in this cave. A thing that fails is not a thing that is finished. It is only a thing that is teaching. So he changed the system. He raised the trays up onto flat, dry stones, lifting them out of the wet that pooled along the floor. He cut a narrow vent crack into the basalt overhead to draw the damp air up and away. And then he did the hardest thing of all. He waited. Outside, the winter buried the western ridges. The wind hammered the mountain day and night, and the snow came down in waves that hissed against the outer wall, and the world beyond the black stone became a white and roaring nothing. But inside, beside the warm earth, the dog slept. And one morning, the man crouched down to check the trays the way he had every morning, expecting nothing, the way a person learns to expect nothing when they have been disappointed enough times. And stopped, green, tiny shoots, pale and trembling, no taller than a fingernail, pushing up through the dark soil toward a sun they would never see, drawing instead on the warmth that rose from somewhere deep beneath the mountain. Life in the dead center of winter, in a cave of black stone, in a place the whole valley believed held nothing but a fool and his lies. Life. The man knelt there for a long time without moving. The first leaf trembled faintly in the warm air rising from the stone. He reached out, slowly, the way a person reaches toward something they are afraid will vanish if touched. And he laid the back of one cracked, scarred finger against that single green leaf, so gently it did not even bend. He did not pick it. He could have. He was hungry. He had been hungry for weeks. A wiser man, a more desperate man, might have taken it, but he did not. Because the leaf was not food. Not yet. The leaf was a promise. The leaf was proof that the dead man had been right about everything, that the stone kept heat, that the seeds would wake, that a person cast out into the dark could take that dark and that stone and that cold and make out of all of it something that grew. The dog wandered over and sniffed the trays, curious, and then looked up at the man with the patient confusion of a creature who does not understand why he has gone so still. Ezra Holt knelt beside the green and the warmth and the quiet, and for the second time since the door had closed behind him, something in his chest loosened. The town had called him a liar. The preacher had called his fear a sickness. The hard-faced woman had counted her flour and turned him out into the cold, her hand closed around a secret she would not show. And up here, alone, in the black heart of the mountain, he had built a fire that knew where to send its smoke, and a roof that had failed and been mastered, and now this. Green leaves. In winter. Down in the valley, the snow was beginning to bury the fence lines. The children were beginning to cough in the long, dark hours. The flour barrels were beginning to run low. The man did not know that yet. He only knew the warmth of the stone beneath his hand, and the small green life trembling in it, and the slow, even breathing of an old dog who had chosen again and again to lie down beside the fire he had made. He did not know that they would come for him, that before the winter ended, the very people who had laughed would climb these slopes on their hands and knees. He only knew, kneeling there in the dark, that he was not finished, that the mountain had taken almost everything and given back one small green leaf at a time. A reason to go on. The hardest part of that winter was not the cold. It was the not knowing. The days fell into one another, gray and short and the same. He woke in the dark, he fed the fire, he hauled the wood and tended the trays and read the wind and slept and woke again in the dark. And somewhere in the long middle of it, a small and bitter voice began to speak to him. "What is any of it for?" the voice asked. "Who will ever know?" He had built a fire that would not smoke. He had grown green leaves out of black stone. He had done the thing his uncle swore could be done. And there was no one to see it, no one to nod, no one to stand in the doorway and say, "You were right, after all." Down in the valley, they were still calling him a liar. He was sure of it. They would call him a liar all winter. And when the spring came and the snow pulled back and the worst had passed, they would simply stop saying his name at all. That was the crueler thing, not the lie, the forgetting. A man can build something perfect in the dark where no one looks, and still wonder if a thing unseen is a thing at all. He sat with that some evenings, longer than was good for him. And it was the dog who answered the question, not in words. The dog had no words. But on the worst of those gray evenings, when the man sat too still and too long with the bitter voice, the old hound would rise from the warm stone and cross the floor and lay his graying head across the man's knee, and the man would put his hand on it. And that was the answer, because the dog did not care whether the valley ever knew. The dog did not measure the fire by who admired it. The dog only knew that it was warm here and safe here, and that the man's hand was here, and that those things were enough, had always been enough, were in fact the whole of it. The man came to understand something in that long middle stretch of dark, that a good thing built in secret is still a good thing. That warmth given to one old dog is not smaller than warmth given to a crowd. That a life does not need an audience to have been worth the living of it. He stopped waiting to be seen. He simply kept the fire. And somewhere in the keeping, the bitter voice grew quiet, and then went away, and did not come back. The first real storm came down off the heights after dark. For weeks the winter had only been practicing, testing the ridges, sending its cold ahead like a scout. But now the thing itself arrived, and it arrived the way grief arrives. All at once and from every direction, and far larger than anyone had let themselves believe. The wind struck the mountain hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling cracks. The snow came sideways, hissing against the outer wall in long dry waves. Even inside the black stone, where no wind reached, the man could feel the pressure of it. A weight in the air. The deep, low groan of a mountain bracing itself. Cinder felt it first. The old dog rose from beside the hearth, and the fur along his spine stood up in a ridge, and a low sound rolled in his chest. Not the sound he made for weather, the sound he made for men. Ezra Holt set down the wood in his arms and went still. He had learned by now to trust the dog's fear more than his own ears. And then he heard it too. Footsteps. Out there in the screaming dark, where no sane man should have been, where the cold alone could kill a person in the time it took to lose their way. Footsteps. Slow. Even. Deliberate. Not the stumbling, broken rhythm of someone freezing to death. Something steadier than that. Something that had come on purpose. A fist struck the outer door. "Help!" a voice shouted through the storm. "Man's freezing out here. For God's sake, open up!" Ezra did not move toward the latch. Neither did the dog. Because a freezing man does not knock like that. A freezing man fumbles. A freezing man falls against the door and slides down it. This knock was strong. This voice had breath to spare. This was a man pretending to be dying, so that a kind man would open the door. The second blow was not a fist. It was a length of oak, swung hard, slamming into the doorframe with a crack that shuddered through the willow and clay wall. Dust sifted from the ceiling. The whole entrance shook. But it held. The wall the man had built with his bleeding hands, the lattice packed with clay and horsehair, the basalt set into the base. It held. "My father died because of Jonah Holt," the voice screamed from outside, and now the pretense was gone, and what was underneath it was raw and shaking. "That thief took freight meant for the winter camps. Men starved. My father starved. And you—" Another blow. The wall groaned. "You're up here keeping his fire warm." Ezra knew the name then, knew the family. A grievance carried so long it had stopped being grief and turned into the only thing the man had left to hold. Hollis Dane. The man stepped closer to the entrance. He did not raise his voice. He had learned, somewhere along the way, that the quiet thing is more frightening than the loud thing. "If you strike that door one more time," he said, "the cold out there won't be the most dangerous thing waiting for you." Silence. For one long breath, only the storm spoke. And then a rifle cracked from somewhere high along the ridge. The sound of it tore through the mountainside like splitting timber, rolling and echoing off the stone. Not aimed at the man, aimed past him, aimed to say one thing only: "You are not alone out here, and the next one will not miss." Ransom Brooks, the old scout, had not gone as far as he'd let on. Outside, boots scrambled across snow and loose rock. A curse, swallowed by the wind. And then the footsteps were gone, fleeing back down into the white, and the storm closed over them like water over a stone. Only then did the man kneel beside his dog. Cinder was trembling, violently, his whole old body shaking against Ezra's hand. Not from the cold, from the fear. And the man stayed there a long while, his arm around the old hound, until the shaking eased. Ransom Brooks came in a few minutes later, snow across his shoulders, the cold smell of the rifle still on his coat. His hands were shaking too as he pulled off his gloves. He sat by the fire for a long time before he said anything at all. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the dry certainty it usually carried. "Don't like pointing a rifle at a man," he said quietly. "Even one who's earned it. Even one who came to do harm." He stared into the coals. "Cold does things to people," the old man went on. "Makes them small. Makes them mean. A man loses someone in a hard winter, and he spends the rest of his life looking for somebody to blame for it. Because blaming the winter—" He shook his head. "There's no comfort in that. The winter doesn't care. You can't make the winter sorry." Cinder settled down between the two men, his head across his paws. Ezra looked toward the entrance, where the snow still hissed past the cracks in pale ribbons. The storm out there did not hate anyone. It did not remember names. It held no grudge, kept no ledger, sought no revenge. It only did what the winter had always done, the way it had done it long before any of them were born, and would go on doing it long after. The bitterness. That was not the storms. That was the people's. People were the ones who carried it across the seasons, who fed it through the long dark, who let it harden in them the way water hardens to ice. Ransom rubbed his trembling hands together near the fire. "The storm don't remember who you are," he said softly. "People do." And that was the truest thing either of them said all night. The second one to come through the storm did not knock to deceive. She came because she had nowhere else. It was a few nights later. The worst of the wind had eased, but the cold had deepened into something brittle and absolute. The kind of cold that makes the snow squeak underfoot and turns breath to frost on a scarf. And out of that cold, a woman came stumbling up the slope. A young mother. She had wrapped her son against her chest in every blanket she owned, and she had climbed a mountain in the dark to reach a man her town had cast out as a liar. Because somewhere, in the desperate arithmetic of a frightened parent, the liar had become her last hope. Her name was Della Belle. And the sound coming from the child in her arms was the sound that empties a mother out from the inside. Thin, wet. The sound of air trying to move through water. The man pulled them inside without a single question. Snow melted across the basalt floor as Della sank down beside the hearth and laid the boy down on the warm stone. She did not apologize for the town. She did not explain why she had come, or who had treated him how, or what she believed, and what she didn't. There was no time for any of that. And she was a mother. And the only thing in the world to a mother in that moment was the small, struggling chest of her child. She unwound the wet wool scarf from the boy's neck with shaking hands, and laid it beside the warm stones to dry. And then she saw them, the green, just past the firelight, along the wall of black rock, where the warm earth ran beside the stream, the small living leaves of mountain crests, trembling in the heat that rose from beneath the mountain. Fresh green leaves, in the dead heart of winter. Della Belle stared at them, and something broke open in her face. She had walked through a killing cold carrying a dying child, and she had not wept, because mothers learn to hold the weeping back when the holding is what keeps the child alive. But the green leaves undid her, because the green leaves meant that this place was not a lie, that the man was not a fool. That up here, while the valley starved and shivered and called him names, he had been quietly growing life out of stone. The tears slipped down her face without a sound. Ezra said nothing about it. He had no use for a person's shame. He only set the iron kettle over the fire, and into the water he put what his uncle's old bundles had given him. The inner bark of willow, the green tips of spruce, the soft, dried leaves of mullein, the cave filled with steam and the sharp, clean smell of pine and bitter wood. He drew a blanket up into a small tent over the boy's head and let the vapor gather there and let the child breathe it, slow, while the fire cracked and the storm muttered somewhere far outside. And the dog. The old dog, who had every reason to keep his warm place by the fire, rose and crossed the floor and lay himself down against the boy's small feet, as if to lend him the last of an old creature's warmth, as if he understood, in the way that animals sometimes seem to understand, exactly what was at stake. For nearly an hour, no one spoke. The mother watched her son. The man tended the fire. The dog kept his vigil. And slowly, so slowly, that at first she did not dare to believe it, the hard, wet rattle in the boy's chest began to ease. Della heard it before she let herself feel it. The change in her son's breathing, the catch loosening, the wet sound thinning, drop by drop, the way the frost had thinned from the ceiling stone on that long night the man had worked alone. She pressed her hand to her mouth. The man heard it too. He did not smile. He only nodded once to himself and added another stick to the fire. Before dawn, while the storm still groaned along the ridge, he wrapped several handfuls of the mountain cress in a clean cloth and pressed it into the mother's hands for the road home. "Don't tell them about the greens," he said quietly. "Not yet." She looked up at him, not understanding. "They'll believe a sick boy got well," he said. "That's a thing people can hold. But green leaves growing out of winter stone." He shook his head, slow. "They won't believe that part first. Give them the small miracle. Let them work up to the larger one." Della Belle rested her hand against the warm stone wall beside the hearth before she left. Just for a moment, and the look on her face made plain that even now, even with the cress in her hands and her son breathing easy against her chest, part of her could not quite believe it either. That was all right. The man had stopped needing to be believed a long time ago. The next time the town gathered, it was inside the chapel, with the wind pressing hard against the old glass. The cold crept up through the floorboards no matter how the iron stove glowed near the front. And every few minutes, somebody coughed. Then somebody else. The sound moved through the pews like a tide that would not go out. Reverend Silas Crane stood behind the pulpit with both hands resting on the open Bible. He was a man who had spent his life sure of things, and the winter had begun, quietly, to take that surety from him, and he did not like the feel of its leaving. "There are people," he said, "who have begun climbing into those mountains, trusting in stone, trusting in hidden places, trusting in the works of one man's hands, instead of in the provision of the Lord." His voice was steady, but underneath it, something strained. No one answered him. The snow hissed against the chapel walls. And then a woman stood up. Della Belle. She rarely spoke in public. She had never been the kind to. And the whole room turned to look at her, this quiet young mother standing in her damp coat with her hands folded in front of her. "My boy," she said, "slept through the night." The room went silent. She swallowed and made herself go on. "First full night," she said, "in 3 weeks." That was all. No speech, no accusation, no grand defense of the man on the mountain. Just a few plain words, spoken by a mother, hanging in the cold chapel air. And every person in that room remembered the coughing that had carried through the settlement in the dark, remembered their own children, their own grandchildren, the thin, wet rattle in small chests that no prayer had yet been able to quiet. A full night, 3 weeks. The words did more than any sermon. Then, near the back, a bench creaked. A heavy man rose, slow, turning his hat nervously between his big hands. Otis Bell, the one who kept the supply room, the one who had refused, weeks ago, to sell the strange man so much as an extra measure of salt or lamp oil. "I should have stored more flour," Otis said, "before the roads closed." His voice was rough. He did not look at anyone. He warned me. Holt warned me. And I called it panic, and I sent him off, and now my shelves are near empty, and there's children going hungry. He turned the hat. Should have listened. That's all. Should have listened. And no one mocked him. That was the thing. In a winter milder than this one, someone would have laughed. Someone always laughed. But there was no laughter left in the room. There was only the cold and the coughing and the slow dawning of a thing too heavy to say out loud. Silas Crane looked down at the open Bible in front of him. His jaw tightened. Once, the chapel waited for him to go on, to reclaim the room, to say the thing a preacher says to put the world back the way it was. Instead, he closed the book, slowly, with both hands. And the soft sound of it shutting echoed louder in that frozen room than any words he could have spoken. A few nights after the chapel, the dog rose and faced the entrance again. But the low sound in his chest was not the one he made for danger. It was softer, curious, almost glad. The man opened the door to a small figure, half buried in snow. Toby Lane. The lame boy had climbed the mountain, alone, in the dark, on a leg that turned every flat step into work and every slope into a war. How he had found the way, the man never fully learned. The boy would only say that he had followed the smoke, and that he had fallen more times than he could count, and that he had gotten up every time, because a dog had once taught him that getting up was the whole of it. The man brought him in and thawed him by the fire and did not scold him, though the climb could have killed him, because there are some things a person has to be allowed to do. Cinder pressed against the boy's side, and the boy buried his cold face in the old dog's fur, and for a while neither of them moved. "They're saying your name again," Toby said at last, into the warm dark. "Down in the town. Nobody's laughing now." The man fed the fire and said nothing. "I still have it." The boy reached into his coat and drew out the old folding knife, the handle worn smooth by a hand long gone. "You told me to keep the one thing that was still mine. I kept it. Through the whole winter, I kept it. It got me through." The man looked at the boy for a long moment, at the limp and the cold burned cheeks, and the fierce, stubborn light in him that the relief house had never managed to put out. And he reached over to the wall, where his uncle's worn journal sat on its shelf, and he took it down, and he opened it across the boy's knees. "You want to be of use to them?" the man said. "More use than a broom in a corner to sleep in?" The boy nodded, fierce. "Then learn to read this," the man said. He turned the crowded pages slow, by firelight. "Not the words. Anybody can read words. Learn to read what the words are pointing at. The frost on one side of a post. The wrong way birds. The elk coming down too soon." He tapped a page. "Someday this book is going to be yours to keep," he said. "Not yet. There's reading left in me. But someday it'll need a keeper younger than I am. And I'd rather it was a boy who climbed a mountain on a bad leg to tell me the truth than any grown man in that valley who waited for the truth to come knock politely on his door." The boy stared at the journal like it was a live thing. "Why me?" he whispered. "Because you came up," the man said simply. "Everybody comes down a mountain. Almost nobody climbs one in the dark, on a leg like yours, for no reason but to say thank you. He closed the book gently and set it back on its shelf. That's the whole of who gets to keep it, Toby. The ones who climb. That night, with the boy asleep by the fire and the dog stretched out between them, the man sat awake a long while, watching the two of them breathe. He had walked out of the valley with nothing, and here, somehow, was a boy who had climbed a mountain on a ruined leg, just to tell him that a few words by a dark woodshed had been enough to carry a child through a killing winter. The fire he had built was warm, but it was not the warmest thing in the cave that night. The deepest cold came after that, the kind of cold that does not pass through, the kind that settles in and means to stay. The snow buried the lower half of the cave entrance more than once, and the man had to dig his way out into a world gone white and silent and strange, where the wind had carved the drifts into frozen waves, and the whole mountainside looked like a sea that had been stopped mid-motion. That was why he almost did not see her. Later, the others would piece it together. How the relief house had emptied faster than she'd let anyone see. How she had set out alone, against all sense, to find the one man who might know how to keep the last of the children alive, and to say a thing she had carried far too long. The storm had taken her halfway, and nearly all the way. It was the dog who found her. Cinder stopped suddenly beside the drifted entrance on one of those white blind mornings and gave a low, uncertain whine. He would not go closer. He only stood, looking down at the snow, at the shape half buried in it, and made that sound. The shape was a woman. She had fallen against the outer wall of the cave, in the lee of the wind, and the snow had begun to claim her. Her hands had already gone gray with the cold. It was Edith Vance, the woman who ran the relief house, the woman who had stood with folded arms and turned him out into the dark, the woman whose hand had closed around something hidden all those weeks ago in a moment he had never understood. The man did not hesitate. Whatever she had done, whatever she had been, she was a person freezing at his door. And he had spent this whole long winter learning, over and over, that you open the door. He dragged her inside. He wrapped heated blankets around her beside the hearth. Melt water dripped from her boots onto the stone floor, and for a long while she could not even hold the tin cup he pressed into her hands. Her fingers would not close. He waited. He did not ask her why she had come. He had learned not to ask. And when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than he had ever heard it, smaller than that hard, certain voice that had turned a town against him with a single sentence. "My mother," she said, staring into the coals, "healed people. Once. A long time ago." The fire cracked softly between them. She knew roots, bark, how to bring down a fever, how to ease a chest. People came to her in the bad years. Edith's hands tightened around the cup. And then the children started dying anyway, the way children do in the bad years, no matter what anyone knows, no matter how hard anyone tries. Outside, the wind groaned through the rocks. And the town needed someone to blame, she said, because frightened people always do. Frightened people can't blame the fever. The fever won't hear them. The fever can't be made sorry. She looked up, and her eyes were wet and old and tired beyond the winter. So they blamed her. The woman who'd tried the hardest. The woman who'd known the most. They blamed her because she was close enough to touch. The man said nothing. He was beginning to understand, and then Edith Vance reached into her coat, into the same pocket her hand had closed around that morning weeks ago, when she had stood before the crowd and called his warning panic. She drew out something small and dark with age, a compass, an old brass compass, the case worn smooth, the metal gone dim with the handling of many years. The man's breath caught, because he knew that compass. It had belonged to Jonah Holt. "I kept this," Edith said, "after he died." Her voice trembled now, all the hardness gone out of it. "Not because I hated him. People thought I did. I let them think it." She turned the old compass over in her gray, shaking hands. "I kept it because I knew. I knew what happens to the ones who see things other people can't. The ones who read the snow, and the smoke, and the way the birds fly wrong. The ones who try to warn everybody." She looked at him then, full in the face. "It happened to my mother. It was going to happen to you." The cave was silent, but for the wind and the low shifting of the coals beneath the shale. "That morning," she said, "when you came to warn us, I saw it starting. I saw the way they laughed. I saw how it was going to go." Her hands closed around the compass. "And I thought, if I push him out now, early, before it goes any further, before they really turn on him, maybe they'll just forget him. Maybe forgetting is the kindest thing this town has left to give." Her voice broke. "I thought if I sent you away," she whispered, "they wouldn't destroy you completely later." And there it was, the thing he had not understood, the hand closing around the secret, the hardness that had never quite reached her eyes. She had not turned him out to be cruel. She had turned him out to save him, in the only clumsy, broken, human way she knew how. The man looked at her for a long time, at this hard woman gone soft with cold and confession, at the old compass shaking in her hands, at the grief she had carried so long it had reshaped her whole face, the way grief does, the way it had reshaped Hollis Dane out there in the storm, except that her grief had turned inward, into protection, while his had turned outward, into a length of oak against a door. Two people, the same wound, two different shapes of carrying it. And the man understood, kneeling there in the firelight, that he could be angry if he wanted to be. He had earned the right to be angry. She had cost him his place, his name, his standing among the only people he had known. But anger was just another grudge, and he had spent a whole winter learning, from a storm that held none, that the grudge does nothing to the cold. The grudge only freezes the one who carries it. So he reached out, and he took the old compass from her shaking hands. She flinched, as if she expected him to keep it, to take back the thing she had taken, to make her pay even a little for the door she had closed. He did not. He turned it over once in his scarred fingers. His uncle's compass, the needle still swinging true after all these years, still pointing the way north through the dark, the way it had pointed for the dead man who had taught him everything he knew. And then he set it back down, gently, beside her hand, on the warm stone near the fire. He gave it back to her, without a word, without a lecture, without making her say sorry or beg or carry 1 ounce more of the weight she had already carried too far and too long. He simply gave it back. Edith Vance stared at the compass on the warm stone beside her hand, and then she began to weep, quietly, The way a person weeps when they have braced for a blow that does not come, when they have prepared their whole self for punishment and been met, instead, with mercy. The man added a stick to the fire and let her. Some things a person has to set down on their own. You cannot take the weight from them. You can only build a warm place and leave the door open and let them come in out of the cold to lay it down. Hours later, exhaustion finally took her, and she slept beside the fire, the old compass still cupped loose in her open hand, and only then, only when she was deep asleep and safe and warm, did the old dog rise from his place by the hearth. He crossed the cave, slow and stiff in the firelight, and he lay down across her feet, the way he had lain across the sick boy's feet, the way he had pressed against the man's back on the first cold night out in the white, giving the last of an old creature's warmth to one more person who had finally come in from the dark. The man watched the dog do it, and outside the wind went on, the storm went on. The winter went on doing what the winter had always done, indifferent and enormous, sparing no one, and asking nothing of anyone. But inside the black stone, beside a fire that knew where to send its smoke, beneath a roof that had failed once and been mastered, 3 people had now come in from that storm. A man who came to do harm and was turned back. A mother who came in terror and left with her child breathing easy. And the hard woman who had closed the door, come at last to open her own heart and find, on the other side of all her fear, not the punishment she had braced for, but a fire and a sleeping dog, and a man who gave the compass back. The winter was not done with them. Not nearly. Down in the valley, the snow was rising past the fence lines, and the flour was running out, and a roof none of them yet knew about was groaning under a weight it would not much longer bear. But something had shifted on the mountain that night, something the cold could not touch, and the storm could not bury, and the long dark could not freeze. The man did not have a word for it. He only knew, watching the old dog breathe slow across a sleeping woman's feet, the firelight moving gold across the black and ancient stone, that the thing his uncle had built here was never really a shelter from the weather. It was a shelter from what the weather did to people, from the smallness, the meanness, the blame. It was a place where a person could come in out of all of that and be warm and be forgiven and begin, at last, to thaw. The roof was the first thing to break. Not a person, not a heart, a roof. Down in the valley, the supply shed that held what little grain the town had left gave way beneath the weight it had carried too long. The beams had groaned for days. Everyone had heard them, and everyone had told themselves the sound meant nothing, the way people do when the truth has grown too heavy to lift. It came down before dawn. The sound of it carried across the frozen valley like something splitting open. By the time the gray light arrived, the people of Hollow Creek stood around the wreckage of broken beams and buried grain, and they understood, at last, the thing none of them had wanted to say out loud. They were not going to make it through on their own. The snow had swallowed the roads. The flour was nearly gone. The children burned with fever beneath thin blankets, and the soup grew weaker every night, one spoonful thinner than the last. The well-meaning prayers had not lowered a single drift. The certainty that had felt so warm in the autumn had frozen solid along with everything else. And up on the mountain, a thin line of smoke had been rising all winter long. Clean, steady, certain. The smoke of a man who had told them and been laughed at and gone anyway. For a long time, no one in that broken yard would name him. Naming him meant admitting it, and admitting it was a colder thing than the wind. But the children were coughing. And in the end, it is always the children who break a proud town open. So they climbed. There was no other choice left. And choosing the only thing left is not really a choice at all. It is surrender wearing the coat of a decision. Otis Bell put together a sled team. The big, quiet man who had once refused to sell the stranger so much as a measure of salt or a tin of lamp oil now tied a rope across his own broad shoulders and leaned his whole weight into the slope. He did it without being asked. He did it first. Perhaps because a man who has wronged another carries a debt heavier than grain, and the only way to set it down is to bend his back beneath something harder. Silas Crane came too, the preacher who had stood before a frightened crowd and named the man's warning a sickness, who had said that some men spend too long in the cold and forget how to trust anything but their own dark thoughts. That same preacher took up the second rope and bent beneath it and said nothing at all. A few other men came with them. They dragged firewood and empty sacks and what tools they could spare up a slope that punished every step. The climb took the whole of a short winter day. The wind tore across the high ground without mercy. It found every gap in their coats. It drove the breath back down their throats. Twice the sled rolled sideways into a drift, hard enough to nearly haul the men off their feet. And twice they hauled it out again, grunting, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the mountain had not already said for them. Halfway up, one of the younger men sat down in the snow and would not rise. He was not hurt. He was only afraid. The slope had taken something from him that he did not know how to get back. It was Otis Bell who went to him. The big man crouched in the drift beside the younger one, and he did not lecture, and he did not shame. He only said, "Lo," so the wind nearly took it. "I sent that man off this very mountain in the autumn, told him there was no room for his kind of fear. And here I am, dragging an empty sack up to his door, hoping he's got more grace in him than I had." He held out his hand. "Get up," he said. "We've both got something to be sorry for. No sense freezing over it." And the young man got up. The frost gathered white in Silas Crane's beard until his face looked carved from salt. He did not complain. Not once. A man who has finally closed the book on his own certainty learns, somewhere in the cold, how to be quiet. And the quiet, it turned out, became him better than the speeches ever had. Then, near the failing of the light, they saw the smoke up close, thin, steady, rising clean from the black ridge into the freezing air. It was not the smoke of desperation, not a fire fed in panic, guttering and lurching against the wind, the kind of fire a man builds when he is losing. This smoke climbed straight and sure, the smoke of something built, something understood, something defended day after day against a cold that wanted it gone. The smoke of control. and the door opened before they reached it. Before a single fist could rise to knock, the narrow wooden door set into the black stone swung inward, and warmth rolled out to meet them across the snow. Not the warmth of a hearth alone. Something steadier, something stranger, a dry, even patient warmth, the kind that does not come easy, the kind a person builds with bleeding hands and guards through 100 long nights against the weather that means to kill it. The man stood in the doorway. He did not gloat. He did not fold his arms and make them name what they had done. He looked at the rope worn into Otis Bell's shoulders, and the frost in the preacher's beard, and the empty sacks they had dragged up a mountain in the desperate hope that the man they had cast out might have it in him to fill them. And he stepped aside to let them in. Inside, they stood in the warm dark and could not find their words. The basalt walls held the heat and gave it back slow, the way good stone does. Strips of meat hung curing above the smoke shelf, dark and dried and good. The gravel near the entrance lay dry despite the snow packed hard against the outer wall. The bedding was raised on its dry platforms. The trench breathed the wet air away, and along the far wall, where the warm earth ran beside the quiet stream, green, living leaves, mountain crests and onion tops and the tender shoots of turnip, pushing up out of black stone, in the dead center of the hardest winter the valley had ever known. No one spoke. The men stood there breathing steam into the warm air, snow melting from their coats and running in dark lines across the floor. And they looked at it all. The fire that knew where to send its smoke, the dry bedding, the cured meat, the warm and ancient stone, the impossible green. And they understood, every last one of them, what they were looking at. The thing they had called a lie, standing all around them, keeping them warm. No one said the man had been right. No one needed to. The saying of it would have been too small. The proof surrounded them on every side, in the warmth on their faces, in the smell of curing meat, in the green leaves trembling faintly in the heat that rose from beneath the mountain. Words would only have cheapened it. There are moments when silence is the more honest tongue. Otis Bell lowered his eyes first, and Silas Crane, the preacher who had named this man's fear a sickness, who had told a chapel full of frightened people not to trust in the works of one man's hands, took the bundle of firewood from his own shoulder and set it down quietly against the wall beside the hearth. He did not look at the man while he did it. He could not, but he set the wood down, an offering, the closest thing a proud man has to an apology, when the words are still too large to fit through his throat, and the man accepted it the only way that mattered. He put the kettle on. He did not make them wait while he savored anything. He did not draw out the moment to make it sting. He moved among them the way he had always moved, slow, sure, unhurried, and he warmed broth, and he passed it out in tin cups, and he gave the sick the place nearest the fire without being asked. A man who has truly been wronged and has truly let it go does not perform his forgiveness. He simply pours the broth. And one by one, the men of Hollow Creek took the warmth from the hands of the man they had cast into the cold, and could not meet his eyes, and drank. That was how it began. The thing the cave would become. Because the town did not merely survive that winter, It survived because of what the man had built, and because, after that long night, he began to share it. Sled loads went down the mountain in the worst of the weather. Cured meat, bundles of greens, when the greens came in thick enough to spare. The knowledge of how to brace a roof, how to bank a fire, how to keep a fever from turning into something worse. The valley made it to spring, thinner than it had gone into the winter. Humbler, certainly, but alive. All of them. Even the children whose coughing had carried through the dark. Even the families who had run their barrels empty. Even the proud ones who had laughed in the autumn and learned to be silent by the thaw. They lived. And living, they remembered. That was the thing about a hard winter survived. It carves itself into people. It does not let them forget who carried them, and how, and at what cost. When the snow finally pulled back from the slopes, they did not go back to forgetting him. They came back, after the thaw, and the winter after, and the winter after that. Not only from Hollow Creek now, from valleys farther off, places that had only heard the story told by a freight driver or a passing trapper. The story of the man on the mountain who could read the weather like print, who had turned a hole of black stone into a place where no one had to freeze. Ranch hands came, hat in hand, to learn what their grandfathers had forgotten. Trappers came, men who thought they already knew the cold, and went home, knowing it better. Widows came, women left alone with children and a hard season ahead, and no one in the world to show them how to get through it. And the man taught them, patiently, the way the dead man had once taught him, not with speeches from a height, with his hands, and with the slow, undeniable weight of a thing proven true. He taught them how to keep bedding from drinking the cold up out of the ground, how to stack firewood so the snow could not rot the lower rows, how to read the wind against the ridge stone, how to notice the winter coming before the winter announced itself. He never charged a soul. He only asked one thing of every person who climbed his slope and warmed at his fire, that when their own hard season came, they would open their door to the next one caught out in the cold. It was not a rule. He did not write it down. He simply said it once to each of them, quiet, near the fire, the way a person passes on the only thing that ever truly mattered. Pass the warmth on. That was all. And the strange thing, the thing the man himself marveled at in the late years, was that they did. There was a widow, in one of those later winters, who climbed the slope with 3 children, and no notion of how to keep them alive till spring. Her husband had been the one who knew such things. And then her husband was gone, the way they go, and she stood in a cold house with 3 hungry mouths and a woodpile that would not last, and a fear so large she could not find its edges. She had heard the story, the way everyone had by then. The man on the mountain, the cave that kept people warm, and in her desperation, she did the thing the proud town had once been too proud to do. She climbed. The man took them in. He did not ask after her husband, because he had learned that grief does not want to be asked after. It wants to be let alone in a warm room until it can breathe again. He fed the children. He gave the woman the place nearest the fire. And over the days the weather kept them, he taught her, the way he taught everyone, with his hands and not his mouth. How to bank a fire so it held through the night. How to keep the damp from crawling up into the bedding. how to read the one side of a fence post the frost touched first. And when the weather broke and she made ready to take her children back down, she stopped at the door, the way they always stopped, and tried to find the words for what she owed him. The man stopped her before she could. "You don't owe me," he said. "You owe the next one." She did not understand. "Someday," he said, "there'll be a knock at your door in the worst part of a winter. Somebody half froze, somebody the rest of the world's decided not to look at. And you'll be tired, and your own stores will be thin, and every sensible voice in you will say, 'Keep the door shut.'" He looked at her, steady. "Open it anyway. That's the whole of what you owe me. That's the whole of what anybody owes anybody." The widow went back down the mountain, and years later, word climbed back up to the cave, the way word does, that on the coldest night of a hard winter she had opened her own door to a stranger nobody else would take, and that the stranger had lived, and that the warmth, once given, had simply gone on giving itself, the way the man had always said it would. The boy came back too, Toby Lane. The lame child who had once crept out into a freezing yard to feed an old dog half a dry biscuit, who had held out his dead father's folding knife and been told to keep the one thing that was still his own. He grew, the way children do when someone finally believes in them. The limp never left him. But it stopped being the thing people saw first. What they saw first, in time, was the boy who knew the weather, who could walk a valley road and tell you, from the ice on a creek, and the lean of the smoke and the early restlessness of the elk, what the season meant to do. He became the keeper of the journal. Every autumn he walked the roads, just as the dead man had once walked them, recording the frost depth, the creek ice, the direction of the falling snow, the movement of the elk down off the high ground. The worn pages filled, new pages were sewn in, and the reading of the weather passed down. From a dead man, to a man the town had cast out, to a limping boy who had believed when no one else in the valley would. There came a day, years on, when Toby stood in the cave with a journal open in his hands, and looked up at the man, and said, "What if I get it wrong? What if I read it wrong, and folks trust me, and I get it wrong?" The man was quiet for a while. "You will," he said at last. "Some season, you'll read it wrong, and you'll lose sleep over it, and you'll want to throw the whole book in the fire." He set his hand on the boy's shoulder. "And then you'll open it back up," he said, "and you'll write down what the wrong taught you. That's the whole of it, son. A roof you don't trust until it's failed you once. A book you don't trust until it's been wrong once. That's not the end of knowing. That's the start of it." Toby kept the journal after that without fear. And the hard woman found her peace. Edith Vance never spoke much of that long night by the fire, of the compass given back, of the great weight she had carried so far and finally set down on the warm stone. Some things a person does not narrate. They only live differently afterward, and let the difference be the telling. But the hardness left her face, over the seasons, the way frost leaves the ceiling stone, when a cave at last learns how to breathe. She helped after that, with the ones who came up the slope, with the sick and the frightened, and most of all with the children. She knew roots and bark the way her own mother had, in the bad years long ago. And up here, on the mountain, where no one needed someone to blame, that knowing was no longer a danger to her, It was just a gift, used at last, the way a gift is meant to be used. She and the man did not speak of love or of what they were to one another. They were past the age and past the need for naming it. But on the long evenings, she sat by his fire, and he was glad of her there. And that was its own quiet kind of answer. The compass stayed on the wall, beside the dead man's carved initials, where its needle could go on pointing true. Even the man who had come to do harm found in the end a strange and partial peace. Hollis Dane never climbed the slope again. The grief that had driven him to that door in the storm did not simply vanish. Grief like that rarely does. But word came down, in time, that he had stopped drinking and taken work, and that on the anniversary of his father's death, he no longer went looking for someone to blame. A trapper brought a message up the mountain once on Hollis's behalf. Just a few words, awkward, half-finished. He says he's sorry for the door. He says he understands now it wasn't your uncle's doing. He just needed it to be someone's. The man listened. He nodded. And he sent back only this: tell him the door's not locked. Should he ever come up out of the cold? Hollis never did. But the trapper said the message landed in him like a stone dropped in a still pool, and that the rings of it went on spreading for a long time after. That was enough. A man cannot mend everyone who hurts him. He can only leave the door unlatched and let the warmth do the rest, or not, in its own time. And through all of it, through all the seasons, all the people who climbed the slope, all the lessons given and the lives quietly kept, the old dog stayed by the fire. Cinder grew very old. His muzzle, already gray when he had first walked out into the white beside the man, turned white as the snow itself. His eyes clouded at the edges. His back legs stiffened until the climb to the timber was beyond him, and then the walk to the entrance. And then, at last, even the short trip across the cave floor. But he never had to go far. The warm spot by the hearth had always been his. Most evenings, while the man read the weather marks by firelight, or while the people who had come to learn talked low in the warm dark, the old dog slept beside his chair, exactly as he had slept that first winter, when it was only the two of them, when the fire smoked the wrong way, and the roof leaked frost, and a whole valley below had called them both fools. The man would reach down now and then, without looking up from the page, and rest his hand on the old dog's side, just to feel it rise and fall. The young ones who came to learn would watch him do it and not understand. They saw a great man, the man who had saved the valley, the man whose name was spoken with something close to reverence in towns he had never seen. They did not see what he saw when he looked at that sleeping dog. They did not see the frozen yard and the closing door. They did not see the old hound turning north toward the dark mountains, and never once looking back. But the man saw it, every time, because the dog had been the first, long before the boy, before the mother and her feverish child, before the hard woman with the compass came in out of the snow, before the whole valley climbed the slope with empty sacks and bent heads. The dog had simply chosen to go where he went, to press close on the killing nights, to pull him up off the freezing stone when he wanted nothing more than to lie still and let the cold have him, to cross the cave again and again, season after season, and lie down beside the fire he had built and tell him, in the only language that had never once lied to him, "This is right. This is warm. This is good. Stay." There came an evening, late in another winter, when the fire burned low and good, and the cave was warm, and the snow fell soft and steady outside the black stone. The cave was empty that night, but for the two of them. The learners had gone down before the weather closed in. Edith was below, tending a sick child in the valley. It was only the man and the old dog and the fire, the way it had been at the very beginning. The old dog lifted his head from his paws. He looked toward the entrance, the way he always had, reading something out in the dark that no person living could read. His ears worked once, then settled, and then he turned, with great effort, and looked at the man. A long look, steady, clear somehow, despite the clouded eyes. The kind of look that passes between two who have come a very long way together, who have nothing left to prove to one another, and never did. The man set down the journal. He moved his chair aside, and he lowered himself, slow, his own knees no longer young, down onto the warm stone floor beside the dog. He laid his hand on the old creature's side. "Easy now," he said softly. "You did everything right, every bit of it. You went where the warm was. You always knew." The dog's breathing slowed. Out beyond the black stone, the winter went on the way it always had. Indifferent. Enormous. The same patient winter the man had read long ago, in the frost on a single fence post, when not a soul in the valley would believe him. But the dog was not out in that winter. The dog was by the fire, where it was warm, where it was safe, where the man's hand rested gentle on his side, rising and falling with each slow breath, and the firelight moved gold across the old stone, and there was nothing left in all the world to fear. And then, softly, the way a thing ends when it has had a full and faithful life, with nothing left undone. The breathing stopped. The man sat with him a long while. He did not weep at first. He only sat, his hand on the old dog's side, in the warmth and the quiet and the slow falling light, remembering a frozen yard and a closing door and an old hound who had turned toward the dark mountains and not once looked back. The fire settled. A coal shifted and sighed. And after a time, the tears came. Not the hard, breaking kind, the other kind. The kind that comes when something has been so good and so long and so faithful that the only fitting answer to its ending is to let the heart spill quietly over. He buried the old dog near the entrance when the ground allowed it. In the thaw, beneath a flat stone, he sat there with his own hands. He did not mark it with a name. The ones who knew, knew, and the ones who came after would ask and be told the story, and that was how the dog would go on living, in the telling, the way the dead man went on, the way all the good and faithful ones go on, long after the breathing stops. He was not alone now. That was the strange, soft truth of the late years. The man who had walked out into the white with nothing but an old dog and a dead man's worn journal was not alone anymore. The cave was full of voices most nights. The boy he had saved kept the weather now, walking the roads with the journal under his arm. The woman who had cast him out sat by his fire and used her gift without fear. The valley that had called him a liar sent its children up the slope to learn from him, and named their own children after him, some of them, without ever quite saying why. He had, in the end, everything a person could ask for: a place, a purpose, people who needed him, and a few, at the last, who loved him. And still, some evenings when the fire burned low and the snow came down soft outside the black stone, the man would reach down beside his chair, out of an old habit the years had not quite worn away, to rest his hand on a warm side that was no longer there. His hand would close on nothing for a moment, and then he would smile, just a little, sad and full, both at once, the way the truest things in a long life always are. Because grief, he had come to understand, is only love that has nowhere left to go. And the warm spot by the fire, where an old dog had slept through all those long winters, where a man had rested his hand 1,000 quiet times just to feel a faithful heart go on beating. That spot would stay warm a while yet. It always did. The stone kept the heat, longer than people, longer than grief, longer, almost, than the man himself, who lived out his years in that warm dark, teaching the ones who climbed his slope to listen to the world, and who, when his own last winter came, was not afraid of it. How could he be? He had spent a lifetime learning that the cold was not cruelty, that the winter meant no one any harm, that it was only ever doing what winters have always done, and that what a person built against it with bleeding hands through the long dark and then gave away freely, that warmth was the only thing that ever truly lasted. He had learned it as a boy, without knowing he was learning it. His small hand pressed flat to a slab of dark and patient stone, still warm long after the sun had gone down. Stone keeps heat longer than people. Someday it'll matter more than you think. It had. It had mattered more than anything. And on the soft evenings, with the fire low and the snow falling and his hand closing gently on the warm and empty place beside his chair, the man understood the last of it, that nothing built in love is ever truly lost, that nothing given in warmth is ever fully gone, that somewhere, in the deep, patient heart of the stone, in the boy walking the roads with the journal, in the doors that opened all down the valley now, to whoever came in from the cold, the warmth went on, quiet, faithful, the way the old dog had always been, the way, in the end, the best of us learned to be.